Alright, so in this section we're going to take a quick look at the Redshift car paint material. It does have quite a number of layers and is maybe a little bit confusing, so we'll go through each of these layers one by one. So let me actually start by just turning all of the layers off except for base layer diffuse. And there we go. Alright, so to begin with we have this base layer diffuse color. By default, the weight is set to 0.5. Weight is just going to influence how much we're contributing to the final shader value. So we have pigment color, which is the color of our paint. And then we also have this edge fall off. And essentially what this is going to do is say, as we tend to be facing away from the camera, let's change the color. By default, it's set to black. And you can see if I bring the curve factor downward, we start to bias more toward our edge fall off color. And if I raise my curve factor, we start to bias more toward the pigment color. Now you can actually set a color for this if you want. And this can actually be pretty helpful if you're trying to really dial in the look of your car paint. Might be helpful. Now, something to keep in mind about base layer diffuse is it's actually going to influence our metallic flakes values as well. So why don't we go ahead and talk about metallic flakes next. So I'm going to go ahead and just set the weight up to 1. And initially we're not really going to see much effect. That's because we're actually very rough currently. So if I go ahead and take my glossiness value up to 1, you're going to see we start seeing our flakes up here in the highlights. So I'm going to jump around in here just a little bit, but we'll get through all these values in just a second. Next, I'd like to look at scale, which if we increase our scale, you're going to see that we increase the size of our flakes. Then we have density, which is going to control how many flakes exist on the surface. Next, let's look at variation, and that's just going to describe how varied in angle the flakes are on our surface. So if we increase this guy, we might have to decrease our density to see the effect a little bit more clearly. Maybe let's kick that up to 0.5. They're not too overlapping. There we go. So you can see there's quite a bit of variation in the values that are being returned for the flakes. Whereas if I take my variation down to 0, well, the effect disappears. But as I begin to increase my variation, you're going to see we're picking up light from different directions in the scene, which is ultimately what gives us our flake look. Alright, so let's talk about decay distance. This is kind of a cool one for our flakes. As I increase decay distance, you'll see that it almost kind of increases the overall roughness of our flakes, meaning that the highlights are going to get wider and we're going to see a much longer fall off across the surface. Whereas if I bring my decay distance way down, our highlights are going to get very narrow by comparison, and we're no longer going to see that variation being pushed across the surface. Next up we have Fresnel controls, and that's going to control how bright flakes are depending on which direction they're facing. So we've got facing reflectivity and perpendicular reflectivity. So facing is going to describe flakes that are pointing at the camera, or pointing in the direction of the camera, and perpendicular is going to describe the flakes that are pointing away from the camera. So you'll see if I take perpendicular reflectivity down all the way. Right now we don't have any effect because our curve factor is biasing highly toward our facing reflectivity weight. When the value is higher, it's going to bias towards facing reflectivity weight, and when the value is lower, it's going to bias toward perpendicular reflectivity, which we have set to 0. So as we bring the curve factor down, you're going to notice in our flakes that they start to look very sparkly by comparison. And if I bring it very, very low, you're going to see the disparity between the flakes in our highlights and our other surrounding flakes begins to get higher and higher. Or they start to look, or rather we start to bias towards our 0 perpendicular reflectivity weight. Whereas if I bring the curve factor all the way back up, you'll see our flakes are now illuminating significantly more than they were before. All right, so let's take a look at base layer specular. We have a weight that will drive this guy. I'm going to go ahead and set this weight up to maybe like a 0.3. And you're going to notice that it's very rough. This guy is here to give us control over a rough or faceted base layer, a specular. So for example, in this case, we're just have a rough specular, but we could, for example, if we wanted to have carbon fiber, we could pipe a carbon fiber bump map into our bump input, which we can find under advanced/bump. And this would give us the option to have a underlying bump map, or in this case, just a very rough glossiness specular layer, and then go into our clear coat reflection and put a clear coat over that underlying layer. So now you can see if I go into clear coat reflection and dial that up to 0.3 as well, you can see we have our rough specular underneath and we have our clear coat resting on top. And this is going to allow you to add a lot of interesting details into your car paint shaders. So I've actually gone and set up another shader that we'll just look at really quickly. Got this kind of cool blue car paint. Let's just dive into that guy real quick. You can see I've set my pigment color to this blue color, which is ultimately, again, influencing the metallic flakes color, which you can see the flakes are showing up kind of bluish in tint. I've added just a very light, almost indigo fall off color to the pigment with a very low curve factor. I've disabled the base layer specular because in this case I don't need to use it. And for our flakes, I've added a very glossy flake type. As well, I've gone ahead and increased my weight above 1 because at 1 I wasn't too happy with how apparent the flakes were. So you can actually over crank the metallic flakes if you like, which is highly inaccurate, but helps us get to the result that we're looking for. And then in the end, I've just added 0.5 clear coat reflection, almost perfectly glossy as well. And it gives us this pretty rad, hot rod, metallic car paint look. Thanks for checking out the car paint section, and we'll see you in